welcome to the goResilient podcast. In this episode, we discuss how interest rates work, the shortcomings of the modern environmental movement, and our own first-hand experiences this growing season. So I thought that we would start this episode by talking about how interest rates work. The reason for that is because if you're thinking about making any investment or borrowing money, you really have to have an understanding of how interest rates work in the economy. One thing I've been seeing a lot lately is people holding off making investment or doing things because they're anticipating that interest rates are going to be lower in the future. Like you hear this all the time that when Powell at the Fed is going to lower rates, and then that's going to make everything cheaper and more affordable, and it's going to be easier economically for everybody. But the reality of the situation is that interest rates get priced in ahead of time. So, like every other market, interest rates are also a market. So, people are speculating on what rates will be in the future. So, just because the Fed comes out and lowers rates, that doesn't immediately mean that there's going to be immediate impact on the interest rate. So, for example, by January, there's between 3 and 4 interest rate cuts already priced in. So that's between 0.75 and 1% change in the interest rate is anticipated by January. So that's what the market expects. So if Powell comes out, who's the head of the Fed, and lowers rates by 25 basis points, that's already anticipated by the market in the next meeting. So like the real discussion that traders are having right now is whether Powell will cut the interest rates by 0.25 or 0.5% in the next meeting later this month. So that's already expected. And because it's expected, that's already priced into bond yields, mortgage rates. So like just because Powell comes out and either cuts or raises interest rates, that's already expected and priced in by the market. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I will say that I had no idea that this was true before you just explained it to me a few minutes ago. It's pretty fascinating. I mean, I, like most people, had proceeded with the assumption that when interest rates change, such as the Fed dictating that change, that yeah, like now all kind of mortgage rates and all those things change along with it. In fact, this was always based in that assumption of mine was always based in my experience of getting a construction loan for my own house. I was fortunate enough to do that in the time right in the middle of COVID when interest rates were at really record lows. And so I've always been able to enjoy a relatively low mortgage payment. But I never really kind of knew anything about the, sounds like you're kind of describing a certain amount of elasticity, or maybe that's not the right term, but sort of responsiveness by market forces to the Fed's announcements or any sort of indications that allow those market forces. So I guess that would be banks and mortgage brokers and traders, that would allow them to anticipate those changes, and they would basically respond by changing their prices. It's pretty
Yeah,
fascinating.
that's absolutely right. And the way it really works is that when they change the rate, what they're actually changing is the federal funds rate. And what that is that's the overnight interbank lending rate. That's the rate that commercial banks lend and borrow from overnight. And the reason they do that overnight is because the Fed requires banks to have reserve requirements. So, like, they have to have collateral for the amount of debt obligations that they have. And if they're a little short, then they have to borrow money. That's actually who, like, when they change the rate, that's who it affects is commercial banks. And then it kind of echoes through the system from there. So, that's very different, though, than like what a mortgage rate or what a bond yield is. Those ones are the ones that are speculated on ahead of time. So, for example, like last year, I think interest rates peaked around like 8 or 8.5% for mortgage rates peaked around 8 or 8.5%. But now, if you check, let me see, let's ask Grok here what the 30-year mortgage rate is.
Oh, goodness.
We're aided by AI now. Okay, so according to Grok, the average 30-year mortgage rate in the US as of late August to early September has been reported around 6.35 and 6 to 6.5%.
Oh,
So they haven't really lowered the rates much since then, but
Mhm.
the anticipation of future rate cuts is already being priced into the market. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Now, my question is, what are some of the can you explain a little bit more about what some of the indications are that the market, so to speak, looks for in order to adjust their prices?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, the Fed controls the rates in order to control the economy. For example, if there's a bad jobs number, like they release the jobs data every couple weeks, and then months later they revise it, so that's that's a separate story. There's a lot of room for fraud with that that's been exploited over the last couple years. But so, for example, if there's a bad jobs number, like if there's more people laid off or not as many people are hired as they expected,
Mhm.
then it's going to be anticipated that they're going to lower the interest rates in order to spur more economic activity and consumption to get GDP back up. And like that's really the mechanism by which the Fed can control the economy to some degree. So like after 2008, that's when we entered the ZIRP period, it's called. It's the zero interest rate policy, where basically like banks and I mean banks especially were able to borrow money from the Fed basically at 0%. And then the ripple down effect of that is that like high net worth individuals and corporations were able to borrow money for again virtually 0%. And that's when mortgages were like 2 or 3%. So the purpose of that was because after '08 the economy crashed, so they brought the rates to zero in order to spur the economy, so that people would consume more and get GDP back up. And that basically continued up until a couple years ago. And then during COVID, they printed a ton of money. Well, by locking everybody inside, like economic activity kind of ceased to
Mhm.
some degree. So then they printed a bunch of money, and that stimulated the economy again. But a negative externality of that was that we started to get a massive increase in inflation, higher than most of us have ever seen in our lives. And then once they started to see significant inflation, then that's when they basically panicked and just started raising the rates really fast. So that's when you saw 8% mortgages. But like I said, so now they've already come down from that high. Now we're at a stage where the economy is not looking so great and people are kind of concerned about the future. So that's really why they think rates are going to come down. And it's likely that that's going to happen. But the point that I wanted to make with this was that people just don't understand that this stuff really is priced in ahead of time. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's all going to go exactly as the Fed is planning, that they'll hit all of their targets exactly like just because 75 to 100 basis points cuts are priced in by January, that might be 80% priced in by the market.
Uh-huh.
So then the day that they actually do these cuts, the remaining ambiguity will become priced in, but it'll be pretty small. But that doesn't mean there can't be surprises, you know? Like one thing that could be a surprise is if there starts to be like more and more mass layoffs at corporations could really accelerate the timeline in which they want to lower the rates. And like I said, jobs data and things like that.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that is pretty interesting stuff. What should a regular person make of that? Like that's kind of my question. Like what does a person who is hoping to I mean like yourself or myself who either, is owning property or wants to own property, how does that information help?
Well, I think it's just important to understand that there's a balance to be struck between acting economically prudent and pursuing some of the things that you're either trying to build or invest in personally. So
Uh-huh.
I mean, on a personal note for us, like we were waiting to buy a house for a long time, hoping that prices would come down and obviously rates are so high. But I mean, at a certain point, it's a trade off between trying to time the market and pursuing what you
Mhm.
need, right? So, like, if you're holding off on a project because you think that rates will be lower in the future, I'm just pointing out that a lot of this stuff is already priced in. So like if
Right.
waiting for that might not
That's
be
not gonna be the saving grace that you might necessarily be hoping for, and maybe it's just worth it to go for it regardless of what the interest rate is.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
the flip side of it is that like people want to see lower rates, but they don't lower the rates unless they have to lower the rates. If we get to a situation where we have 0 interest rates again, it would have been predated by some horrible economic collapse or crisis or job losses. So
And so, like, chances are you lost your job or defaulted on your house by that point.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it always works out that way too. You can try to be prudent with some of this stuff. Like if you're a billionaire and you have time and energy and effort to try to time this whole macro situation, then that's something that you should be trying to be more nimble and
More
predictive.
resilient.
Yeah, sure. But if you're a
Yeah.
normal person waiting to buy a house or make an investment in your property or buy a second property to lease out or something, like the point is that this stuff is priced into the market to a large degree. But that doesn't mean that surprises won't disrupt the quote unquote plan a little bit. But yeah, I think because it's just something that I wanted to bring up because I've heard a lot of people say that they're holding off on doing things because they anticipate that money will be cheaper to borrow later. And in my experience, that's just not really the best reason to not be pursuing what you're trying to pursue. And you shouldn't let that be something that slows you down.
My thoughts, I guess, on that from a less educated point of view on this whole thing, it just sort of strikes me that policies made at that level, I don't know, I guess if they were intended to help the average person in any way or allow for any sorts of advantages, well, then I feel like we'd be seeing that play out a little bit more clearly over time, and that doesn't appear to be what's happening. I mean, I guess for the average person, yeah, like I consider myself very much the of the class that does not, you know, I'm I'm struggling to even understand a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. So it's like a lot of these higher level kind of financial things don't, it almost for people like me, it seems like it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to worry about what interest rates are. It's just sort of my concept of not, which is again not to say that like I just said a moment ago, I benefited from them pretty directly, but I don't think that I would have, like you're saying, I don't think I would have allowed that to stop me from doing the same thing if I could have it at a slightly higher cost. I probably would have anyway. I think the point though is there's never an argument to be made against preparing, and being resilient and kind of structuring one's life in a way that is as independent of these higher level things that ultimately we don't control as possible, because that's the thing is you can, however well you understand these things, however involved in the market you are, I think, I don't know, maybe you disagree, but it seems to me that the average person's scope of control is pretty limited. Ultimately, whatever the interest rates are, it's not going to be you or me who decides how any of that works, but we do decide where we live and what we plant in the ground and what we build and the work that we do and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And I think the other important point is that none of the decisions they make, really in any large bureaucratic institution, is designed or tailored to the individual. They're looking at numbers on a spreadsheet on such a macro level that it's so far detached from like the average day to day life that it's so far removed from that that it really does become like a waste of time to worry about it and especially to use it as an excuse to delay moving forward.
Yeah, amen.
We've been doing quite a bit of gardening and setting up the property out here.
And you are in the
Yeah, we're in the Pacific Northwest. So we had and people would be surprised by this, but it gets very hot out here in the summer. Not necessarily like the number on the temperature, but it feels really hot compared to East Coast summers
Mhm.
and really dry too.
Yeah.
So because we came in April, we had pretty much the whole growing season. So we got quite a bit done this year. We set up strawberries, blueberries, raspberries. We got some cherry trees.
How far along are the cherry trees?
They were here when we moved here, so it's
Hmm.
hard for me to judge, but I'd say they're like between 5 and 10 years old.
So are they fruiting already? Or are they actually giving you cherries?
Yeah, they're fruiting, but they're quite small.
Yeah, sure.
And they're
Sure.
sour cherries, not sweet
That
cherries.
oh, dude, that's awesome. Those are the best kind.
But
They're
yeah,
cool.
it's been hit or miss with some stuff. So the strawberries were super successful. I bought just a couple plants of those, and then they've produced not only a crazy amount of strawberries, but they spread unbelievable. So I've made like two huge beds of strawberries now just from like a couple plants. And after producing fruit a couple months ago, they've started sending out the runners now, and like they're even expanding more. So with those, it's like you really have to keep an eye on them or they'll like take over the entire yard basically.
Yeah, berries in general are fantastic. I mean, I can tell you, I hope it doesn't piss you off, but I can tell you that I have a few different varieties of berries. Just, I mean, the season is pretty much over now. I'm getting the very last of them now that it's starting to get pretty cold, but it's I've had blackberries, black raspberries, red raspberries, wild strawberries, and now getting into the grape season, just all summer long. And I never planted a single one. They're just all completely wild and sprung up when the forest on my property was cleared for the construction of my house about 3 years ago now.
Yeah, this is an interesting discussion. I think just before you
For
go on,
sure. For
could you
sure.
just I just wanted to clarify that. So our property is pretty small. Like we have under an acre,
Uh
so
huh.
there's not too much space. How much land do you have?
I have 10 acres of land in a rural farm area, and it was almost entirely forested, and still most of it is, and then they cleared it for the house site, and now I have like about an acre to 2 acres of this kind of rolling foothill type terrain that has been recently cleared, like I said, 3 years ago. And it's really teeming with all of the wild growth that springs up as soon as forest has been cleared like that. So talking a lot of wild grasses and ryegrasses, thorny bushes, berries, all the ones I just talked about, and lots of nitrogen fixing plants basically because the first year the soil was very poor. And all this stuff has really been kind of blooming like crazy.
So do you know where all of not all, but do you know where a lot of the different fruiting species are on your property?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, and it's I've had a lot of fun kind of of course just harvesting it, but just like mapping that out and really allowing the I mean cuz we've talked about this before, touched on it in the past how the whole kind of permaculture concept and the idea of planning out one's property in terms of what you'd like to grow and where. And it has really been a lot of fun allowing that to take place it on its own practically. Yeah, I mean, I guess with if you don't count the massive intervention of clearing the forest. But what has happened is not only have these berry species filled in the void, but also almost every tree that was cleared is being replaced by a black locust sapling, which there had been a fair amount of on the property before it was cleared, but now it's just like the only trees that are growing in the cleared area, and it's pretty cool because that's a very high value wood in general. It's just extremely useful for everything, and it's an extremely resilient tree for this climate. So what I'm basically going to be doing is planning the property, the ecology of the property around those trees. And I plan to do some form of coppicing, which is basically cutting those trees, like topping them, so that I can use them for firewood production. Essentially, stick wood is what they would ideally give me over time if I kept doing that. And so, really excited to sort of plan that whole process and see what happens.
Yeah, it's a very different setup and approach than what I have here. And I think the reason is primarily because of the lot size. I mean,
Mhm.
you might disagree with me, but like we only have so much space to plant things. So then we have to protect them, like with nets and other things like that. Otherwise, the birds and rodents would just massacre them, like once they started fruiting, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was thinking about it. I think the reason really for that is that our property is fenced in. But even if it wasn't, the problem is if you don't have predators that could deter pests, then I think you have to protect your harvest.
I don't know. I mean, okay, so I have had one garden on my property in the 3 years that I've lived there. 1 year I tried to garden. And for sure, a lot of this stuff did get mowed down, but I got enough out of it that I didn't feel it was a total waste of my time and effort, which was not a lot. If I had done more, I probably would have gotten better results. So it's definitely that sort of thing. Like, it just depends on how much food you're really hoping to get. But I will also tell you, this year, for the first time, I got a few birds. I got some ducks and chickens that were all just given to me, and built a just a very simple, cheap little, like, a wire tent. I don't even know what, almost like a little barn, for them to kind of keep them in closed, little fence type of structure. And that was right at the beginning of the summer, back in June. And at this point in time, I mean, I started with 6 ducks, and there were 4 chickens on and on. Anyway, they're all, most of them are all dead. There's one duck left. They all got picked off. I started by free ranging them, and there were just constant issues where they would run off, and I'd have to chase after them and kind of shoo them back in, and eventually excuse me, they would all just kind of not come back. One time, one of the ducks, actually, some little weasel or I think it was a weasel, got into the little tent and just tore her up. So it's definitely a challenge keeping animals, I guess, is really kind of the point with that. The garden is one thing, but if you're going to keep animals, predators will absolutely. I mean, either way, I think the point is you're 100% going to take losses. There is absolutely no way around it. And I think a big part of the, yeah, if you can, in my case especially, you just sort of try to create enough abundance, which is also a little bit easier in my case because I have so much more space, that it doesn't affect you as much.
This is really interesting. This is, I think, part of the reason why I enjoyed Ben Falk's book and perspective so much, and Brett
Mhm.
Weinstein and people like that. It's like, and especially when you start doing this stuff hands on, like you start to really realize that there are like kind of eternal lessons within nature. And especially like when you're working on it and like learning them firsthand, it's really rewarding and interesting to do it that way.
Well, I'll tell you really, really quick, if I can, kind of what I would, the way I would word this is, it's just a philosophy of being low impact. The more you work with these things, at least this has been my experience, you just, there's a way in which it kind of guides you. It sort of shows you very clearly these plants, and the just this whole process. It kind of shows you what it's trying to do.
There's no hard and fast rules for everything, and everything is different depending on where you are, depending on what you're working with, and it's that speaks to the larger point that the environment is always changing and evolving.
That's the hard and fast rule. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's the only rule, is that
Yep.
everything changing.
Totally. That if you follow any rule, you're going to fail eventually,
Yeah,
and
it's like you can't just say like, "Oh, you could just have free range chickens anywhere." Well, you
yep.
can't. Some
No.
places and some places you can't, and like not only based on your region, but based on like your microclimate. It's really only through experience that you could figure out how to interface with it all.
But also, I mean, you can have them and just lose them, like I did. I mean, it didn't really cost me much at all, and I could have just kind of kept on twiddling my thumbs and not ever gotten any birds because I'm not really sure what to do. Instead, I just jumped right in the cheapest way I could, and I messed it up. And I got a whole bunch of eggs out of it in the process, and I learned a bunch of, just about what to do and not do with birds. And here in the next couple of weeks, it starts to get cold. If this one little duck I have it doesn't get eaten by something else, then I'm going to eat her. Because I don't have really any infrastructure to keep her for the winter. And next year, hopefully, I'm in a better financial position. Hopefully, I can get some friends together and build something a little more substantial. It's all just part of the learning process, is really kind of what it comes down to. And understanding that makes all of this not only so much easier, but so much more rewarding.
What do you think was the biggest failure that you had this year?
Oh man. Yeah, that was the birds were definitely a tough one. It's just kind of how all of those got lost. Um, but I was hoping to at least eat one or two of them myself instead of just lose them to predators. But
We had a couple blueberries that we planted that I don't know if it was just because it got so hot and they got torched by the sun because there's no shade. They're just completely exposed.
I see.
So I don't know if it was that or if it was because the soil wasn't acidic enough. But we had some that were near those ones that got shade and they produced like an insane amount of blueberries. So I think it was just the shade issue. So I think I could save those ones next year if I put in some trees that like near them that could kind of
Hmm.
shade them a little bit. So
Hmm.
I'm hopeful that they'll make it, but that was quite a bit of effort to put those in and have it and have them basically die. Like they're struggling for life right now. But we just had so many days where it was like 90 degrees, full sun, and they were just
Yeah.
baking out in the heat. And it gets extremely dry here.
It's amazing I mean, first of all, I love that you planted berries because that's just such a great example of a resilient strategy. I will say it's amazing that even despite that, you had so many struggles. I don't really have a whole ton of experience with blueberries. That's surprisingly, one of the berry types that I have not found yet on my property, despite how acidic the soil generally is. You would think there'd be more blueberries, but yeah, I mean, berries are a great example of a really resilient strategy because they're kind of like they're a lot of work to pick them, but they're also extremely abundant and ultimately very high yield. They're relatively easy to grow. They're a great example of a plant that just like it really wants to grow and it wants to spread. They're super high nutrition, they're delicious, and they are just super abundant throughout most of the summer in most places. So I love that.
Yeah, out here we have there's like an invasive blackberry problem. So it
Same thing out here, so-called
really,
invasive.
yeah, I
Yeah,
was going to ask you if there's invasive any invasive plants or trees out
that's
here.
the biggest bush that's sprung up on my property. Again, people have this thing with invasive plants. It is really, I would honestly kind of love to hear an ecologist or a forestry person, whatever the proper title is, just really kind of explain this whole concept to me. I guess the best sort of reasoning I've ever heard for this whole concept of an invasive species is that they tend to be destructive on crops, on farms. And to me, that is a story about the shortcomings of monoculture and not in any way giving me evidence that a certain plant is a so-called invasive species. I generally do not really accept that narrative. And to me, what I see are plants that are nitrogen fixers springing up in abundance in response to nitrogen poor soils. And these so called invasive species, as far as I understand, over time will in fact contribute that nitrogen back to the soil as they decompose over the cycles, and they will eventually get replaced. I mean, I don't know of a single terrain in a sufficiently resilient ecosystem, a wet ecosystem like the ones that you and I both live in, which does not eventually become forest. So like I don't know of any land in Washington or Vermont that is so overwhelmed by blackberries that it's not eventually going to evolve into a forest.
I don't think the argument is that that it will never evolve past that point, but that the invasive species asserts like a tremendous amount of stress on the current balance, right? And like you're saying, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's like a bad thing, depending on what you're starting with, but it's just that it's a lot of stress and change at once, and like the broader environment hasn't had the time to adapt to that change because the quote unquote invasive species hasn't naturally come up in that environment. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. I guess I what I would add is, while I'm no expert on just, the ecology of most areas of the United States, as far as I know, there are very few areas in this country, especially anywhere that most people like us would live, that are anything like pristine ecosystems. So everything we're talking about is like the terrain is responding to massive disturbances that have taken place there over time. I mean, where I live, for example, all the forest is no older than about 60 or 70 years old at most. Before that, the entire state of Vermont was completely clear cut. Not the entire state, but much of it was clear cut. And so it's like, invasive species in what context? Disturbance in what context? To me, I think I could be wrong, but at least within a certain boundary, it seems like ecosystems have a pretty good way of kind of bouncing back according to their own rhythm, their own time. I wouldn't necessarily want to live in a world where we didn't have any experts in ecology or forestry or geology or water tables. I mean, I would like people to be thinking to some degree in terms of how catastrophic or disastrous effects on human populations can be avoided. But at the end of the day, I also kind of feel like, if there's, I don't know, like a lot of these natural disasters or kind of fallouts from these ecological problems, so to speak, really just come down to, in my mind, too many people in the wrong places.
Flaw in thinking of the expert class as related to the environment and natural world is really the idea that they have to manage it in
Right.
some way.
Or that it's supposed to suit our needs.
Yeah, and but I think there's something to be said for there being, of course, there's a specific niche for humans to interface and be
Sure.
involved in the environment. And I don't think that they necessarily accept that premise even. Like you just hear about all these different types of interventions that they want to make in order to restore something or change something, but it's never really like coming, it never feels like it's coming from the right place or from a proper understanding of the environment.
Yeah, I totally agree. There are way too many people who are ideologically environmentalist who have literally no exposure to nature in their entire lives. Like, I mean, it's amazing how many of them live in towns in Vermont, by the way. Like, it's just totally absurd.
Yeah, and just because something changes doesn't mean that that's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just change. And it's really like the inability for the spreadsheet expert class to really grapple with the fact that these things are dynamic. Just because you could measure one thing or two things or three things and find that the balance is historically different now than it was 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, that's not really indicative of anything, and certainly doesn't justify interventions that will almost certainly cause more negative externalities than otherwise would have been afforded had they not done any of that and spent
Yeah.
all doing it.
Well, and then of course, if they hadn't done any of that, then what? I mean, what use would there be for them? What use would what use would there be for bean counters if there were no Department of Bean Counting? But I guess, yeah, I think that there is just that whole kind of expert class, let's call them, they have a fundamental lack of ability to accept the tragic absurdity of human existence, in context. Like they understand things in kind of human cultural terms and nothing else. And the idea of, I think in the mind of a person like that, if a person falls off the cliff and dies, the problem is the cliff. Like that. And so like they can't think in terms of like, well, we live in this kind of chaotic reality that we're left to figure out how to manage. They just don't like that story,
And the problem manifests its way from there into less educated populations in society too, where like
Totally.
younger people are genuinely terrified about a lot of the quote unquote environmental issues to the point where it really like causes them stress and affects their lives.
I know.
All you have to do is not think about it that way and you'll feel like it'll be okay, you know?
It's so true.
And then even with the experts, it's like they don't even understand that they're the pawns in some corporate or venture capital agenda that they don't even understand. And I think that was kind of clear during COVID. That was made clear in a different way in medical
Mhm.
science. Like you get a lot of these experts that don't really understand their position in the food chain as it's related to economic incentives or political incentives. And they think they're doing one thing, but not only do they not understand the dynamic effects in nature, they don't even understand the dynamic effects within their own personal life or field, you know? And
So true.
really the idea that people like worry about the environment in the United States is so insane to me that I really can't even articulate it well. Like I've spent a lot of time in India, third world places. I mean, like there are real environmental issues in a lot of places. There aren't real environmental issues in most places in the United States. I mean, this is a pristine country compared to most places around the world. And I mean, really, like when we talk about environmental issues, I mean, we should really just be talking about pollution, dumping, a lot of these things that are done on large scale, like monocrop agriculture, like you talk about a lot. Those are the things that should be addressed. But when they have you worried about climate change or
Right.
more broad environmental concerns, you're really just being distracted from the actual issues.
The climate change narrative is, in my opinion, one of the most insidious, disgusting things that has ever happened in the history of my life. I mean, it's just like infuriating to me the way that the idea of being concerned about the fundamental. I mean, I'm tired of even hearing the word environment, even though I don't see anything really wrong with it. It's just become such a buzzword. Frankly, I prefer to talk about the soil, because I feel like it's almost just like in some ways, a more descriptive term, kind of gets at a little bit more specifically what we're talking about, and it's like a physical thing that people can see. I just hate the way that that idea has been conflated with carbon emissions.
Mhm.
This like empirical measurement that just happens to correlate with little more than like how many human beings, like just kind of how much output, which is like a pretty good correlation for just how many people there. It's almost like a very thinly veiled way of saying there are too many people. And
Absolutely, yeah.
there's
And
just too much breathing and farting going on. It's like that's the issue. It's not dumping all of this like crazy toxic poison into the water people are drinking. It's not the lead pipes. It's not the like, I mean, I could sit here and go on and on.
yeah, I mean, we've done it, but like
We've
it
done it.
really
Yeah.
the biggest issue is that it's a failure in philosophy to really understand what a dynamic system means. I mean, the beauty of it is that if you restore one part of a system, that will lead to positive externalities that resonate throughout the system. For example, in the expert mind, the solution to climate change is to spray, what is it, silver particles
Right.
in the atmosphere?
Change the climate
Yeah.
back.
I mean, that is so insane. If you're at the point
It's
where you're talking about spraying silver into the atmosphere, I don't know how you come back from that. I mean, you're so far
you
gone,
don't you don't come
but it's like
back from that.
that itself should be indicative to you that you have a problem in your
It
reasoning,
it
you
is.
know?
I think it is. I think it is like they know. because that is evidence of insanity. I mean, you know,
Like if you're somebody who founded a company that wants to spray the silver into the atmosphere and you're going to make billions of dollars, well, yeah, then it makes sense for you to advocate for that. But if that's not you, how do you get there? You really have to like just think about this stuff just a little bit to not go that far.
that's what it is I really don't think most people like that, like you're talking about, the masses, you know, who kind of talk about this stuff, they're just not thinking about any of it, and that's pretty clear. I think if you actually spend any time talking to, you know, one of these midwit type folks, who kind of like gets most of their information from the nightly news, or whatever it is that they're consuming at this point, media wise. It's just like there's no critical analysis of any of this stuff.
That is one of the saddest parts, though, that almost everybody would identify themselves as being environmentally conscious or loving nature. But then there's just a way that it gets subverted, and then they wind up supporting all of the things that are going to make it worse.
Totally. Yeah, it is ultimately, and we've talked about this in the past too, there just really is no substitute for integrity. And if what you're ultimately seeing, regardless of the ideology or philosophy or movement, solution, whatever it is that's being expressed, if all the person is doing is repeating words, you know, waving symbols, waving flags, well, then it's just, that is the relevant aspect of what you're seeing. It's not the ideology they're pursuing, it's that they're in a mass group. Like, that's the story.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is people forming their ideas and ideology from hearing somebody else talk about it or from a movie or propaganda
Mhm.
piece as opposed to like firsthand doing anything, you know?
Of
Like
course.
if you're actually working on the land, raising animals or doing any almost none of those people agree with the expert's solution like because they actually
Absolutely.
know.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. I mean, what's really weird is I live in a place that is just like in so many ways a contradiction to that. Like, there's all these people who are very much like, you know, farmers, gardeners, hunters, foragers, and it never ceases to amaze me the kinds of, but, you know, sort of beliefs, ideological beliefs that will come out of people's mouths who their lifestyles are in every way contradictory to that. You know, you would the way they talk, you would think that they live in New York City or Los Angeles, but they live in the hills, and they, you know, grow 80% of their food, and they hunt, and it's like, I the extent to which mass culture is able to permeate, you know, society is really pretty remarkable. I have to admit, it's like it's kind of freaky, you know.
Yeah, propaganda is a powerful tool, and I think a lot of I mean, we're learning more about it, but I think some people are more susceptible than other people. I mean, it's hard to
Yeah.
explain, but it really just gets some people. And but I mean, I don't know. Out here, my experience has been, I mean, you wouldn't expect it, but even out here, people who work on the land and do that kind of stuff. They're mostly in agreement with what makes sense.
Hmm.
I find. I mean, I guess yeah. I'm disappointed to hear you say that about
Yeah,
Vermont.
it
Actually,
varies. It varies for sure, but it's just like there's definitely a class of people very very similar to myself in a lot of ways, on paper at least, who, you know, they move out here, they're like the back to the land crowd, you know, and they're like the permaculture crowd. And a lot of those people are also super into what I would call just the university based culture. You know, what's oftentimes called the left, and LGBTQ and BLM and all this kind of, you know, they, and it always seemed to me like, it seemed to me when I first moved here, or when I first even started spending time here before I moved here, is it seemed like for sure people were kind of partisan aligned. You know, I'll just take Vermont as an example. This is generally kind of true in northern New England, but like people are for sure kind of liberal leaning in this very broad way. But really they're just like conservatives, you know. They're church people, they're farmers, they're like even if they kind of think of themselves as being liberal, they're really kind of not. Most of their liberal opinions are these kind of ideas that don't really affect their daily lives very much.
Mhm.
And I would say that that has become less and less true. But a lot of that is also I've been spending less time with kind of farm people and more time with restaurant people in the towns and smaller cities that we have. And so, I mean, those might as well just be college kids from anywhere. But it's just amazing how that exists so powerfully. It's like right in the middle of all of this kind of very traditional stuff. And again, even I mean, let's not over romanticize it. These farms, they're not traditional, so to speak. I mean, a lot of this is corporate subsidies, and it's all very globalized. It is not the case that rural America is completely apart from urban America, even though there are very clear cultural trends that persist. But it's very much like to bring it back around to how you started this episode, talking about how interest rates are way more complicated than what meets the eye. You can say the same thing about most things, and culture, I think, in America and demographics are very much along those lines. A lot of different things cut through familiar categories in very messy ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks, guys.
Thank you.